So you took a step up from a little point and shoot to a DSLR, and the first thing you're going to want to try and figure out is how to work your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO. And what better place to learn that and get some practice than the county fair. Okay, to be honest, we could easily think of any number of places to practice. But what the heck, it was 10 minutes from home, cheap, and they have funnel cakes. And besides, after nearly 25 inches of rain in 2 months, it was really nice to get out of the house for a while. Getting the desired exposure for your photos depends on how you work with what is usually called the exposure triangle, which very simply is a combination of shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Shutter speed is how long the shutter of your camera is open, and is measured in seconds, or more often fractions of seconds. The smaller the fraction, the faster the speed, or shorter the time the shutter is open. Aperture is how wide open the iris of your lens is. Just like the iris of your eye, the iris of the lens can be made smaller or larger to let in more or less light. Aperture settings are measured in f-stops, which are mathematical calculations that aren't necessary to understand for this basic introduction. What you do need to know is that the larger the number, the smaller the iris opening. This may seem backward, but maybe the best way to think about it is as if they were denominators of fractions as well. So if they were pie slices, f4 would be much larger than f22. This isn't mechanically how it works, but is a handy way to remind yourself. ISO is a measurement of how sensitive your camera is. In the old days of film, it had to do with the size of the silver grains on film and paper. But today, it has to do with how sensitive the electronic sensor in your camera is. We'll look at how ISO affects both of these a little bit later in the video. To understand how shutter speed and aperture work together, think of these two like a seesaw. When one goes up, the other naturally goes down. They want to balance each other out. Say, for example, you are working in aperture priority mode. If you set your aperture at f8, the light meter in your camera will sense how much light it thinks you need for a balanced exposure. In this case, it says 1/60th of a second. Now, if you adjust your aperture up to f11, the camera will automatically adjust your shutter speed down one stop to 1/30th of a second to maintain the same amount of light. Go the other way, and the camera will adjust accordingly. Any adjustment is matched with an equal and opposite adjustment. A good way to start is going to be taking a look at aperture. So they just finished setting up the Ferris wheel, and I've got my camera set, and I'm going to make aperture adjustments from a very small aperture to a very wide aperture. And let's take a look at how the camera reacts when I do that, and what kind of photos we come up with afterward. Let's start with the widest aperture available with this particular lens, which is f3.5. And even at its widest, and with an ISO of 800, the sensor still only gives me a quarter of a second shutter speed, not nearly enough to totally freeze the motion of the wheel, though it's fairly close when you look at it. Stopping down to 5.6, you can see the shutter speed has doubled to a half second. And if you look closely at the wheel spokes, you can also see that they've covered about twice the distance. And now we have f9 and a little over a full second, f11 for 2 seconds, and the baskets are really almost unrecognizable. F18 is a full 5 seconds, and by the time we reach F22, I'm at a full 8 seconds, and the spoke lights are just a blur of circles. Of course, adjusting your aperture changes more than just your shutter speed. It also changes your depth of field. Let's take a look at that in these two photos. Although technically not a part of the exposure triangle, it is important to understand how changing your aperture affects your image overall. In this first image, you can see that, for the most part, everything in the photo is in reasonable focus because the aperture is very small, at f22. This is a very deep depth of field. But the moment I shift to a wide aperture, like 3.5, then I get a very shallow depth of field, and the clarity is totally dependent on my focal point. Here I've focused on the leaf of the ride closest to me, pushing the background out of focus. And in this image, I've reversed that. Again, although not really an exposure issue, it is an important effect of the changes you make in your settings that you'll need to keep in mind. We will take a closer look at depth of field in a different video. So here in front of the zero gravity, we're going to take a look at shutter speeds and how by adjusting the shutter speed inside your camera, the camera will automatically react to change your aperture. Starting at 1 second, the camera responded with an aperture of f11. 1/4 second found an f-stop of 4.5, and 1/10 of a second saw f3.5, which is the widest this lens will go. So from here on, though these photos show more and more frozen motion, they continue to get darker and darker because the lens simply has no more light to offer, until at 1/3200th of a second, the lights are totally frozen, but barely bright enough to see. Now you may have noticed that those last couple images actually showed an aperture of 4.6, and the reason for this is that I shot these photos in the reverse order from which I'm showing you, and I had zoomed in closer to the ride on the first few shots. Zooming with your lens will affect the range of aperture available. At that focal length, 4.6 was as wide as the lens would allow. Again, something to consider when planning and composing your shot. Okay, so what's up with ISO? Remember, ISO is your sensitivity of your camera and how well it picks up light. But changing your ISO will change what your camera does as well. So I'm going to take a couple of photos with different ISO settings and let's see how the camera reacts to that. Before I show you the photo results, let's look at how ISO affects your exposure triangle. The higher your ISO, the more sensitive your sensor is to light, so bumping up your ISO a setting will allow you to adjust your aperture or shutter speed accordingly. For example, let's say you're shooting at ISO 100, but can't get a fast enough shutter speed to freeze the splash of an ocean wave. If you increase your ISO to 200, you will be able to increase your shutter speed by a stop. Or perhaps you want a deeper depth of field. You could adjust your aperture instead. Shifting your ISO changes the sensitivity of your camera, usually by 1 stop per level. Handy, but it comes at a cost. These are the images I took while increasing my ISO. Apart from some subtle color differences which happen because of the changing lights around me, they seem very much the same. But when we zoom in, we can see the difference clearly. At ISO 200, the image seems very clean. However, as I increase the ISO to 400, you can immediately see an increase in noise and grain size. By the time we reach 3200, the noise is easily apparent. In general, you always want to keep your ISO as low as you can get it for the cleanest image, but there are times when it's necessary to raise your ISO simply to get your shot. So I guess the point is, it's a balancing act, trying to find the best balance of shutter speed, aperture, and ISO to get the shot you're looking for. And the best way to learn it is to get out and shoot, shoot, shoot. Try many different combinations and analyze your shots. It won't be long till it becomes second nature. By the way, if you like the content I'm providing, I would greatly appreciate a like. And subscribe also, so you can see more videos as I post them. And of course, I always love questions and comments. Please feel free to leave some. And until next time, have a great day.